Tēnā koutou katoa. And I'd like to acknowledge it's Waitangi Day, and it's a day when this festival has, as a tradition, focused on New Zealand compositions. And so we have not only Iris Dreaming this afternoon, but 2 world premieres tonight. So that makes it for a special day for all of us. And I'd like to welcome to the stage 2 of my friends. One's a new friend and one is an old friend. And that's the old friend, not meaning it in the aged way, but the fact that we've been friends for a long time is Dame Gillian Whitehead, composer, well known to many of you and to New Zealand audiences. And with her is Joanne Roughton-Arnold, who is going to make her New Zealand debut this afternoon as a singer, though she is a New Zealander. So please join me. The Met Opera, I read recently, has just programmed its first opera by a woman composer since 1903. This is the Met in New York. And we perhaps think that many of the operas that we know about were written by men. But Gillian, in fact, is a very prolific composer of opera. In fact, this is her 11th opera. It is.
Is it? Okay.
Yes. I counted.
Okay.
And she's to have 11 successfully produced operas, and we know that this one is going to be produced in New Zealand, but it's already had its premiere in London, is a quite remarkable contribution to the genre in New Zealand. And she and Fleur Adcock have collaborated on 7 operatic or vocal works, so this is also a long-standing collaboration. Gillian spent quite a lot of her professional career overseas. She studied in Australia with Peter Sculthorpe and others, then she studied in England with Peter Maxwell Davies, and then she became a freelance composer, and then came back to Australia, where she had a period as head of music at the Sydney Conservatorium. We all this time claimed her as a New Zealand composer, but the Australians, probably with some justification, thought she was an Australian composer because they were offering her all kinds of commissions and recordings and opportunities, and we were sitting over here thinking, but she's really ours, and we need her to come back, which she has done. And she now, in the late 1990s, she came back to live in New Zealand, and she has lived since then pretty much always on the Otago Peninsula, but very recently she's moved to Ruakaka in Northland, and we'll ask Gillian why she's done this. She's won the SOUNZ Contemporary Award 3 times, including for her opera Outrageous Fortune and for the orchestral monodrama Alice, which was another collaboration with Fleur Adcock. She was an inaugural laureate of the Arts Foundation in the year 2000. She later became a governor of the foundation, and in 2008 she was made a Distinguished Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit and became a Dame in 2009. We make a lot of jokes about dames, but actually she's a great dame. I once wrote of Gillian years ago that she has the ability to take a universal topic and bring it to us in a very personal way that moves and touches us deeply, and I think this afternoon we're going to hear another example of this. And perhaps it was this quality that moved my other guest today, soprano Joanne Roughton-Arnold, am I pronouncing Roughton correctly? To go to Gillian in London with a plan to commission a new one-woman opera, and we'll ask her why she did that in a moment. Few of you will have heard Joanne in performance. In fact, this afternoon, as I said, she's going to make her New Zealand debut as a singer. She now describes herself as a lyric coloratura soprano, and she's based in London. But when she left New Zealand to further her musical studies, she was a violinist. That was 20 years ago, or 22 years ago, I think. And she went to study violin in Oxford and then at Trinity College in London. I'm hoping she'll tell us first of all, in fact we might start with you, Joanne, about your fascinating metamorphosis into a soprano. She now sings a wide variety of operatic roles and in recital programs, and she has a special flair for contemporary music. And it's a great pleasure to have her here, both as the commissioner of this new opera and as its star. So, Joanne, before we talk about Iris Dreaming, can you tell us the story of your shift from violinist to soprano?
Sure. When I was, I think in my last year in New Zealand after I finished my undergraduate degree at Victoria, I was sharing a house with a singer and her husband. And one day I said to her, "Oh, I wish I could sing." And she just said, "Well, don't be silly, I'll give you some lessons." So just for fun, I had a few lessons with her, and in exchange I gave her a violin lesson or two. But I never imagined that there was anything, any potential, certainly no professional potential. It was just a bit of a giggle, and this was good fun. But then when I was in London and doing my postgraduate year in violin at Trinity College of Music, there was the chance to do a second study. So I thought, well, there's something inside me saying, have a go at this singing thing. So I went and saw the head of vocal studies and had a chat to her, and she said, absolutely fine. And she sent me along to Esther Salomon, who was a lovely, wonderful singing teacher in her 80s then, so no longer coming into college. And I had to go out to her house in Highgate in sort of North London. She had this studio in the back garden. You had to kind of walk through the garden, up these really steep concrete steps, and she was extraordinary the way she got around there, through this beautiful garden of old roses, and up into this kind of ramshackle studio that I think her sons may have built for her, that had the grand piano in there. It had a tree stump with ivory growing in the middle of the floor. It's just extraordinary. And she had her singer's platform that you had to stand on when you were singing. But she really got me on the path and establishing a good technique. And I finished my year of violin studies at Trinity and carried on, of course, playing, having some lessons with a teacher I'd had at college, working with Esther. And then I slowly came to the conclusion that I thought I wanted to sing more than I wanted to play the violin, which is a little scary when you've been so fixated on one thing for a long time. And I remember the day that I really decided finally was when I did a lunchtime concert in Bristol. And I think it was the week before my wedding, because my family was still there, when I played the Debussy Violin Sonata and sang some French, some Fauré songs in the middle, and then finished with some chansons on the violin. And it was the songs that I suddenly thought, you're facing the audience, you've got words, it's so exciting having text to play with, and I just love the colours of different languages and the way they almost have a different flavour. So then to have this very kind of intimate connection with an audience was really special, and that I kind of always looked for on the violin, sometimes got, but usually it was quite elusive. But suddenly to have no instrument and it's this direct communication, that was what made me think this is the path I want to follow.
Do you still play the violin occasionally?
I do, and I feel the urge to play some Bach. I get it out, and I have a lovely violin made by Malcolm Collins in Upper Hutt, so it's lovely, a bit of New Zealanders with me. But I still teach the violin. I have a few pupils, so that comes out for that as well.
Yes. Yeah. And you describe yourself as a lyric coloratura soprano.
Yes.
What sort of roles does that open for you?
That's things like Lucia di Lammermoor, Leila from the Pearlfishers. I've got to go and sing that next week, and not a performance, but in a masterclass in Scotland. I've been given a place on a week-long masterclass on French opera with Malcolm Martineau in a very isolated spot on the west coast called Kerr, which is going to be glorious. So I'm going to have to switch hats very fast after today and put my French hat on. and I know what I'll be doing on the flight all the way home. I'm going to be listening, and I'm going to be studying.
Not just your French hat, but your woolly hat, I should
say,
too, if you're going to the west of Scotland.
Oh my goodness, I bought a new possum jumper, and I've got my hat, and I've got my scarf. Yes.
And when you went to Gillian, we'll get onto the story of the opera in a moment, but when you went to Gillian to talk about this one-woman opera, I think you knew her work already. You'd already sung a work of hers.
That's right. When I was doing my postgraduate studies, vocal studies at Birmingham Conservatoire in the UK, my singing teacher there suggested I should look at Gillian's song cycle, Awa Hereia, and I fell in love with her writing, completely head over heels. I sang it in recital there. I think I was probably the first person to ever sing in Maori in an exam at Birmingham. And they loved it, the audience and the examiners both. So that stayed very much a pivotal part of my repertoire ever since.
Yes. Yeah. And Awa Hereia means braided rivers, or braided river? Rivers, I think.
Yes. That was, yes.
Yes. Yeah. It's such absolutely uniquely, it's a New Zealand soundscape that when I was singing it and working, I kept spotting it. But there's obvious things like imitating birdsong is in there, and of course the Maori text. But the bringing in the landscape and the idea of people's coming together and being stronger, different people coming together to make a stronger whole. I think it's really wonderful.
It is. And Gillian, before we talk about the opera, let's talk about you and New Zealand. You came back here, as I said, to live in the late 1990s and moved to the Otago Peninsula, where I think your sister was living too. But did you have any particular connection with Otago at that point?
No, well, I had the Mozart Fellowship, and that took me there. And while I was there, I bought this little cottage by the water at Harwood, and I always felt it had a real batch-like feeling, or crib. And I loved living there, but a couple of years ago, I grew up in Whangarei, and just down the coast from Whangarei is a place called Ruakaka, and we had a batch there, and every summer we'd go and spend the holidays there and weekends there, and it became the place that sort of imprinted as, I don't know, my landscape. I took that landscape with me everywhere. And my parents built a retirement place there, and 2 years ago it came on the market. My sister just happened to be up there and got in touch with me and said, well, you know, we've been to the house, very bad repair. The carpets from 40 years ago were still rotting on the floor. It took me 20 seconds to make up my mind to sell my flat in Sydney, where I'd been teaching. Hadn't even seen the place. And I'd bought by accident strategically in Sydney, so I got a reasonable price for it. And so now I'm living mostly in the north, but I still love the south. I don't know why, you know, the two extremes of the country. I mean, but
maybe that's why.
It.
Maybe there's something about extremes.
Maybe.
That those are often the most. I often think those are the parts of New Zealand that appeal to me: the peninsulas and Farewell Spit and
yes.
all those bits on the edges.
Yeah.
Have a special quality. Since you've come back to New Zealand, have your composing preoccupations changed a bit?
They have, and I suppose one strand started here when I came here. I mean, I had met Richard Nuns before, but it was coming here and spending some time in Nelson and somehow getting to know the instruments from this place. That would have been in the mid-1990s, I think. And he said to me one day, walking through the streets, I'd like you to write something for me. For him and Alexa Still to play in Atlanta. And I thought, yes. So, you know, that was a journey that took me into imagining pre-European world, New Zealand world, and that somehow influenced all my writing, I think, you know, looking back, because you can only see what you're doing 10, 15 years later.
Yes.
So that was a very formative experience,
yes.
working with Richard.
And has given fruit to many compositions that have drawn on mariculture since then. And,
yes.
And perhaps there were some before that too, but Gillian always avoids being called a woman composer, and so I have occasionally got into trouble by asking her about this. and I said once something about, you know, does being a woman make a difference to the way you compose? Because she has to admit that she does a lot of collaborating with women artists, and a lot of her works have told women's stories, like Iris Dreaming. And she said, it's the wrong question.
Did I?
Which is kind of sets you back a bit as an interviewer. You know? but in fact, what you were saying is that actually the question should be about your Maori heritage, not your femaleness.
Yes, and talking to an anthropologist friend in Sydney, she said that's always the thing, that it's always the ethnic thing that's more important than gender in
Yes.
that instance.
Can you tell me about when you first met Fleur Adcock and your first project together?
Well, I was living in Newcastle on Tyne, and I had a 2-year residency there, a fellowship connected to Newcastle University, and I'd been there for a year. And our mutual friend, John Thompson, said to me, "You must come and hear Fleur Adcock reading tonight at New Zealand House. She has just been appointed the writer-in-residence in Newcastle." So I went along and met Fleur, and up in Newcastle, we thought, well, we're both from the same background. We're living in Northumberland. In the north of England. We should do something together. And so we decided to write about Hotspur, Henry Hotspur, who lived in the 14th century, and particularly the battle at Otterburn, which was fairly close to where we lived, and then or in the New Zealand High Commission decided they were going to do it on Waitangi Day. That would have been in 1981. And they commissioned banners from Gretchen Albrecht to go with the production. And the singer, Margaret Field, who was an Australian singer, wearing a red dress with a lectern and these wonderful banners behind. And so that was the first piece we wrote together, and the first of this series of pieces I've done with Fleur, which have dealt with notable women, I suppose.
Yes, because that one was told from the point of view of Hotspur's wife, Elizabeth.
That's right, yes.
So though it was about Hotspur, it was also her story.
Hotspur seen through
Her eyes.
On the eve of his battle at Otterburn.
Yes, and that, as you say, then there's been a series of collaborations, and many of those have become monodramas. And
That's
one
right.
of them that I think of is Out of This Nettle Danger, which is the one about Catherine Mansfield,
Yes.
which I've never seen, but I'm doing a little stirring. I think we should
good.
get it. We should get it. Yeah.
Yes, yes. No, that's one I'm very pleased with.
Yes.
Yes. Well, actually, all the ones I've done with Fleur I've really enjoyed working, and they all have, dramatic content.
Yes. Yes, indeed. So when you needed a story and a libretto for this opera, because Joanne, as I understand it, you went to Gillian and said,
Yes.
write me an opera.
Yes.
Is that right?
As you do.
Yeah.
As you do. Well, I don't know if you do, but how I never have myself, but so you did.
I did.
What inspired you to do that?
I was backstage at Opera Holland Park in London. I was singing in the chorus for Norma, and I've done 5 seasons with them in the chorus, and then some small roles. And the chorus master there for that show is very keen on new music. So I was having a chat with him and telling him about my interest in the same genre. And then he said, in the course of the conversation, he said to me, "Oh, you should commission something." He said, "Commission an opera." And then kind of semi-flippantly but semi-serious, he said, "Commission a one-woman opera." And I said, "All right then." I then had to go on stage for about 20 minutes of sleep acting, because there was a beautiful duet was going on and we were supposed to just be lying on the stage as sort of furnishing. And I had my back to the audience the way it was directed, and all I could do was to lie there thinking, I could ask Gillian Whitehead. Oh my goodness. Oh wow, what an incredible idea. What an amazing project this would be. And then a few days later I phoned Creative New Zealand and said, "So I'm a New Zealander living in London. I've got this idea of commissioning a one-woman chamber opera. Would I be eligible to apply for funding was the first question, and they said yes, I could apply. And then I said, well, I'd just love to ask Gillian Whitehead because I've sung some of her music and I think it's fabulous and she writes so beautifully for the voice. And I said, oh, but I'm not sure what she's going to say. She's a dame, after all, you know.
Yes, it does elevate.
But I thought, anyway. So I sent an email and asked the question. And a few days later, I was totally blown away when I got the positive response. And so it's gone from there.
Yes, and then you went to Fleur.
Yes, I got in touch with Fleur, and she had just finished reading Robin Hyde,
Iris Wilkinson.
Yes. Derek Challis's, I can't remember the name of the book.
The Book of Iris.
Yeah, the Book of Iris,
That's right.
yes.
Yeah.
You know, which is a very detailed biography by her son. And she, Fleur thought it would be very appropriate to do, and what did we think of that? And we both thought we all thought it was a very good idea.
Yes.
And just as a side, a few days ago in our last rehearsal in Auckland, we were able to put on a performance, no costumes, no props, for her son Derek, who was 86. And he had really hoped to come down here, but we gave him a private performance, which he was very moved by.
Yeah, I think we all were.
Yeah.
Yes, because it's a fascinating story, the story of Iris and Derek. In fact, perhaps we should talk a little bit about the story of Robin Hyde and the parts of it that have become this opera. I mean, many of us here have read Robin Hyde. Some of us found out at some stage that her real name was Iris Wilkinson. Probably, if read her work, you probably read The Godwit's Fly. But there are many others, and she's really an important part of New Zealand's literary heritage, but she was also had a tragic life and a tragic end to her life, which, as Fleur Adcock said to me recently rather flippantly, she was asking to have an opera written about her, really, because it was quite melodramatic, the way her life unfolded. But would one of you like to tell that story? Maybe because you're going to be Iris, would you tell us a little bit about that? Sure. And Gillian can chip in the bits that she wants to add. Yes. So she was born in Wellington.
Born in South Africa.
Right, that's right.
In 1906, I think I have that right.
Yes, that is right.
Yep. And then her family emigrated to New Zealand, to Wellington, when she was just a small baby. So she grew up in Wellington. And so did I. I was born there, so I feel a little, that same town. She went to Wellington Girls. She was known as a schoolgirl poetess because she was having poetry published very early on in the school journal, and spotted as being very talented. When she was a teenager, she began working as a journalist. She was reporting for Parliament at 19. Oh, look, I'm saying a line from the opera. Yes. That tends to happen when I start speaking about Iris. I start to quote without meaning to. So she was reporting from Parliament, which must have been extraordinary for a woman at that time, but it was more of a kind of, it wasn't really serious news she was being given to write. It was kind of slightly more gossipy stuff. But being there was amazing. She had a knee injury at a similar age where we don't actually know exactly what happened because she's kind of glossed over how the accident happened, but she injured her knee quite seriously. She was in hospital, unsuccessful surgery, and she became addicted to the morphine that she was given as a painkiller.
Yes. She developed TB, tuberculosis in her knee.
In the knee.
Yes.
So she had this chronic pain for the rest of her life, and hence the drug addiction, just trying to deal with this constantly and if she couldn't get morphine, then whatever else she could get, she would have. Then she got pregnant when she was 20. I've got that right, haven't I? Yes. But being unmarried and pregnant at that time was, of course, a huge no-no. So she was sent to Sydney to have the baby in secret. I think it was only her mother and a friend who knew, not her father, not her sisters. So in Sydney, she had this baby and called him Christopher Robin Hyde, but very tragically he was stillborn. So she had to leave him behind in the cemetery. And her mother came and took her back to New Zealand, and just you can imagine what that does to you mentally and emotionally, especially when you can't tell people what's happened. She began working again as a journalist. She was desperate to replace the baby. Well, I suppose not replace it, but just have a living baby, you know. And so, quite sort of matter-of-factly, she found a man who was just a colleague and married, had an affair with him purely to get pregnant. And then once she was pregnant, then it was like, oh, what now? So she took herself off
to D'Urville Island.
Yes.
Very close.
Quite close. Stayed in boarding houses there, but then was being kicked out by landladies when they realised that she wasn't who she said she was and that she was actually not married. So she gave birth to Derek in Picton. And then had the problem, okay, now what do I do? Got this wonderful baby. Single mother, not good in this society. So she got a wicker dressmaker's basket, and she smuggled him in this all the way through the country to foster parents in Auckland, wasn't it? And was very proud, apparently, that he didn't cry all the way. So, and then in Auckland, again, she's working as a journalist. I think she's getting quite politically active, and still with the drug addiction and the pain, and I suppose all the emotional conflict of not being able to acknowledge Derek publicly because she would have lost her job on the newspaper. Everything got too much, and she tried to kill herself by jumping into Auckland Harbour. She was pulled out against her will completely, and then admitted to a mental hospital in Auckland. Ended up staying there for several years voluntarily. The doctor was really, really helped her a lot. Gardening, got her writing again, and she began writing best-selling novels.
Yes, in fact, it was a very fruitful time for
really
her writing,
fruitful.
actually.
Yeah,
yes.
it really was,
Yes.
that's right. And then she began to get enough money together to travel to England. It was her big goal, was to get to London, and that she felt she could make it there. Then
She wanted to make money to help her son, particularly.
especially so they could maybe be together.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
But also she wanted recognition.
Yeah.
And she felt, and it was probably at a time in New Zealand where if somebody from England said you were good, then you were good.
Yeah.
And so it was part of that
I think so. And I think that
sense of needing that
Yeah.
British, what's the word I'm looking for, affirmation.
Yeah,
yes.
I think, and that comes from the Godwit's Fly, that whole thing
That's
about
right.
kind of Mother England sort of attitude that
Yes,
that she'd
that's right.
inherited from her mother. So that's probably
And it
where
was
it comes from.
what
It's
was
like a
happening in
normal
New
time.
Zealand.
Yeah, exactly. But she didn't take the route that you might think she would take. She went to China.
She went to Hong Kong.
Oh yes, yeah.
Actually, and I don't know if any of you have read Dragon Rampant, which is his non-fiction, but it's about the story. She went to Hong Kong and befriended a young Chinese woman, I think, and then went to China.
Yeah.
It was a kind of a detour, a most intrepid detour. I think what comes through in her life is how intrepid she was, how brave she was, really,
Yes.
and perhaps foolhardy sometimes too, and a bit wild.
Yes.
But she also wanted Derek, I understand it, to know that she was the kind of mother who'd had adventures and did things and went.
Absolutely.
And so that was all. It was all mixed up with that sense. So a little bit. I mean, Fleur's suggestion it was melodramatic. I think in a way it was a little bit, wasn't it? That sense that she wanted to be intrepid and to appear intrepid and for her son.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yes. But then she was in China, and it was during the Sino-Japanese conflict, and the Japanese were bombing. And did she put on a uniform or something and get herself to the front lines?
She put herself in a Chinese uniform and was riding a donkey. You know, she got to the front line. She got the papers, signed to go, and someone who's lame, getting herself to the front line. And there was a time
with a stick, didn't she?
Yes. And there was a time she walked for 50 miles along a railway line or something to get from one place to another.
Yes, to get away, I think, from the front line at that point.
And saw some awful, awful sights. really, really gruesome.
I think she did some nursing there.
She did. Yeah, she was
Yes,
helping a
yes.
friend who was a nurse, I think, wasn't she?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so a huge adventure, but somehow, and she fell in love with China too. It was
Yes.
part of what came out of that, and she had very good friends there that she cared very much about, and then went to London.
Yeah, and she was ill with sprue that she picked up in China, which at that time was incurable. Now it's not.
Yeah,
but
it's a wasting disease, horrible.
it's really terrible. Yeah, yeah.
A tropical disease.
Yes,
Yes.
that's right.
So she then, there she was in London, writing with sprue, lame, in pain, still addicted to morphine,
And
And
no
then?
money.
and no money, and trying to get her work published.
Yeah,
And it was right on the verge of World War II.
yeah.
Yeah.
And wanting to send money back for Derek, and of course she was in this position where she couldn't.
In fact, she was offered repatriation, I think.
Yes, she was. She could have gone back. A lot of people did come back, but she didn't.
No,
No.
They tried to persuade her to go back.
but she didn't want to. No, for a range of reasons. I mean, Derek was settled with his foster family, and
Yes.
perhaps she felt there wasn't a role for her there.
Well, maybe.
Yes. So that's the sad story of the tragic heroine of our opera today. All of the women in this associated with this project have gone away from New Zealand. You did. Fleur did. Fleur hasn't come back, though she visits. And of course, Robin Hyde went. Is that part of the attraction for you in this work, in this story? That you identify in some way with Iris Wilkinson?
Well, to a certain extent. I mean, for a lot of us, I know Fleur, for me, Catherine Mansfield was that sort of figure.
Yes.
But if you think of Robin Hyde, well, Catherine Mansfield came from a wealthy family. Robin Hyde didn't. And in order to make a living, she wrote, she was a journalist, she was a novelist, she was a poet. She just wrote and wrote and wrote. And that was her life, writing. In a very different way from Mansfield. But Mansfield is the figure we all know. Robin Hyde should be too, at least as big a figure.
I think there is more interest in her now, I think, and more writing about her.
Yeah.
Yes,
Perhaps
yes,
the biography helped with that.
yes.
Um,
I'm sure. I mean, if it hadn't been for the biography, we might never have written this.
no, because it told that story in great detail.
Yeah.
Yes, hugely. Gillian, you told me recently that some of the music in the opera has almost got a folk-like quality now. That's not necessarily your usual style, is it, to write in a folky way?
I don't know what my usual style is.
Well,
Parts of it are. When I was writing it, writing the piece, I was feeling somehow I didn't want to write something that Iris herself would have found impossible to understand. I felt I needed to write in an idiom that she would, if not totally understand or enjoy, would relate to in some way. And I couldn't, there were certain things I couldn't have written, and partly that folk telling of stories. Oh, it's a way of dealing with certain parts of the text too.
yes.
And it was quite difficult to write in some ways because there's the structure of the text, and there are musical structures, and there are dramatic structures. And when you're writing, you have to find a way to make all those things gel together. And at times it was quite tricky to make this work.
And Fleur didn't want to tell the whole story of Robin Hyde either. You begin the opera at the end in a way, don't you? So that she's in her room in London,
Yes.
looking back at her life,
Yes.
as-
An attic room in Notting Hill it was.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's where the whole thing is set in the opera. So she's in her room at Notting Hill thinking back about the children, about the breakdown, about the time in China, and coming back to the present day.
Yes. Yes, it's a kind of model of wonderful succinctness, really, because she herself was such a both prolific writer, and also she wrote prose that was full of words, and it was this great sense of profusion about her writing, whereas Fleur's libretto that I've seen is so spare. And how did you feel when after your idea of creating this opera, then there it was in front of you to learn and perform?
It was like all my Christmases had come. I was bowled over. And I mean, I got it in sort of, as things were being created, I was being sent. So I got the libretto first and read through this and thought, this is amazing. And the way Fleur's woven some of Robin Hyde's poetry through the libretto and sort of merging it with her own, it's just stunningly done. We actually open with a couple of lines from Iris's last poem, so it's lovely. And then when Gillian began sending me drafts as she was writing, as she was composing, and I sat at the piano and played through what she'd written, and I did cry because it was just so beautiful. The whole piece is all about telling the story and about expressing these wonderful words. There are challenges, there are all of that there, which is wonderful, but it's not challenging for challenging's sake. It's not trying to be clever. It is just so expressive and gorgeous to sing. So yeah, overwhelmed. Very lucky girl.
Now, on a personal note, you have a visual impairment.
Yes. Yeah.
So you're portraying a heroine who had an impairment too. Can you tell us about what it's meant to you as an artist to deal with that?
With having a visual impairment?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It's an interesting story.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm partially sighted, but most people would have no idea when they meet me that there's any problem, because you learn coping strategies. So essentially, I just see everything out of focus unless it's really close to me. So I don't recognise people unless they're quite close. And I remember making the mistake when I was about 12 of thinking someone was my mother and cheerfully going up, "Hi, Mum." Oh, not Mum. So I learned quite quickly, don't do that. And I have an issue with depth perception, so I just kind of learned to, muscle memory is a wonderful thing. Once I've gone down a flight of steps, I know how steep they are. The first time, I'll be very careful. As a violinist, it was always a challenge because, as a string player, if you're playing in an orchestra, you have to share a music stand. And I could always see the page closest to me, but the one further away would always be out of focus. And certain musical symbols would look the same, like a sharp and a natural sign, and clearly there's quite an important distinction between those. So as a student, I managed to get around it by memorising. So if you're sitting and the conductor turns to the wind section, then I would just lean over, look at the bit I couldn't see, memorise it, sit back, next time fine, play it. And that works when you have 6 weeks of rehearsal before a concert. But in the professional world, that's not the way it works. And quite often, especially if you're freelancing, and certainly in London, the rehearsal periods are minimal, and you can find yourself just rehearsing on the day of the concert. So there's just no time to memorise. And then when I made this transition to singing, there was all the positive reasons that I described earlier, but there was added bonus that, oh my goodness, as a singer, you don't have to share a music stand. You memorise your music, or you hold it where you can see it, and it stops being a problem.
Yes.
I was very coy about saying anything as a singer for a while, because sadly some people do make 2 and 2 make 5, and when they hear that you have a sight impairment, they assume that you might fall off the stage or do something ridiculous. So, so I stopped saying it. I didn't say anything. And then when I was working for Opera Holland Park, and I was in my 4th season there, the Royal National Institute of Blind People got in touch with me, because I've done quite a lot of work with them, initially as a client, and then leading some workshops for visually impaired children, singing workshops and so And they got in touch with me because they were collaborating with Opera Holland Park on a workshop for visually impaired children based around the children's opera by Will Todd, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And so the RNIB said to me they would love me to be involved in the workshop in some way, helping the kids. So that meant I needed to talk to management and sort of explain why the RNIB were requesting this, and then let them in on my little secret. So I spoke to the assistant producer and said, well, I've just been talking to James at the RNIB, and he would like me to be involved in this workshop. Because I'm partially sighted, and the jaw hitting the floor was quite amusing. But they were just fantastic. I explained why I had kept it quiet, and I said, as I just said to you, that sometimes people jump to the wrong conclusions. But I said, hey, I've been up 2 metre scaffolding in Rigoletto, and I've carried lighted candles onto stage, and I haven't fallen off or set light to the theatre. So, they immediately got me involved in the workshop, and said no, and they would have had me there straight away. And the following year, I led the workshop, which was just delightful to have all these kids singing all these songs from the opera and messing about, playing with props and doing some touch tours and things.
Yes. Yeah. So you said as a visually impaired person you had to develop coping strategies, and presumably you had to demonstrate a lot of courage too, though you haven't mentioned that. Yeah. But did both the coping strategies and the courage was something that Robin Hyde needed, didn't she?
Absolutely.
And so perhaps does that help you to identify with the heroine you're going to sing?
I think it does, and that kind of thing of being really strong, and I'm going to stand up, and no matter what people tell me, if someone tells me I can't do something, I'm going to find a way of doing it.
Yes.
If someone says no, then I just find another way around. And I think that's
the person she clearly was.
Yes, very much so.
Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. The version we're going to hear of Iris Dreaming today is even more intimate than the London version. The London version had one singer and 10 musicians.
And a conductor.
Yes. And it was done in quite a small stage, because I've seen a video of it, and you were quite close to the audience at that point.
The audience were having to tuck their feet back at times as they went past.
Yes. Whereas today, it's a bigger venue, it's a proscenium arch, you're on a stage, but it's an even smaller ensemble, just the New Zealand Trio. And Gillian, you were asked to rearrange the work for this smaller ensemble. Was that a bit of a challenge?
Yes, it was. You've got 10 instruments, all capable of playing lines simultaneously or whatever you want to do with them. Then you're down to a cello, a violin, and a piano. But actually, it took a while, and also I was thinking, gosh, I'd really like to write this for orchestra. Which wasn't quite the...
Yes, well, let's think about that.
I'm game.
Yes. But, in the end, and you'd sort of look at a bit and sort of think, well, I could put that on the piano and that on the strings, or actually if the strings could play that with double stopping, that would work, and just sort of playing around with things until... Yes. And then, of course, you still have to get the variety through the score, so that it makes a kind of organic whole and whole, that sort of whole.
Yes. Yes, but the piano is a nice versatile instrument. Stravinsky did exactly that actually with the Soldier's Tale. He had a big ensemble, and then he took it down to a trio with a piano in it. Yes. So,
but of course, it made a difference in staging because, Joanne had a conductor to follow in the London performance. Here, there's no conductor. So it's real chamber music, real chamber opera.
Yes, lovely.
And just a different way of thinking about it.
Absolutely. So I get very listening, I think, more acutely than when you've got a conductor who is going to give you a downbeat and you're just watching for that and then you're going to go. When you have to just do it completely orally, with a little help, watching bows are great. But it's been really fascinating working with the trio. We've had a really great length, we had the luxury of quite a long rehearsal period. So we've got to know each other very well and get to know each other, how each other works. So I feel as though I know the work more intimately
than I would have done if we hadn't had this version. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we're really excited and looking forward to it very much. And I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. If anybody's got anything they'd like to ask either of these two about their work or, again, indeed about anything.
There's somebody over there.
Ah, thank you.
I'd like to ask a question not related to today's performance, if you don't mind, though I have just read The Godwit's Fly, which is why I'm here. But I'd like to ask how you got in touch with Peter Maxwell Davies and what sort of work you did with him, Julie.
Well, I was living, I did a degree at Sydney, and for 2 terms he was teaching at Adelaide Conservatorium. And halfway through his teaching there, he came and gave some talks in Sydney, and I thought to myself, I trust this person. You know, if he tells me what I'm doing is rubbish, I'll walk away. So I took some scores to him, and he didn't say that. And I said to him, can I come to your class in Adelaide? Sure. So I went there for the second time, and at the end of that, I'd been thinking of going to Italy. But at the end of that time, I said, do you take students in London or in England? And he said, I haven't. And I said, if I come, would you teach me? And he said, yes. So I changed my plans, went to London, and it was a really good way of teaching. I mean, we'd meet for 3 or 4 hours with a bottle of wine and some food every 3 or 4 months. No, every 2 or 3 months. I'd do some work, and we'd just sort of sit and talk. And it was, you know, really about giving me confidence as much as anything, and how to make my notation better, because it was pretty appalling at that stage. And so, you know, gradually from that, I became a freelance composer in London, and we kept in touch, you know, on and off.
It was a lifelong friendship, really, was
Oh,
it
yes,
not? Yes, and
yes.
was it last year he died?
Last year,
I
yes, it
think.
was last
Yes,
year. Yeah.
Yes, and
I'd hoped to get back to Britain last year, you know, but
I think you visited him in the Orkneys at one point.
oh yes. For
More
quite a
than
while, he was touring the world, you know, coming out here and so on, and he had this wonderful croft in Orkney, and when he was away for a month or 2, I would go up there and house sit, and it was a lovely place to work, and no electricity, sort of no running water. There was a stream along, you know, and I've never been healthier. It was wonderful.
I think this is another opera story we've got going here.
Sounds like
Gillian in the Orkneys. Yes. Was it summer, I hope, when you were there? Yes. Any other questions?
Yes, I wanted to ask Gillian, her opera Tristan and Isolde, has that been performed many times since the debut in Auckland 31 years ago?
It had a few performances after the first run in Auckland. It had a couple in Sydney, and the BBC recorded it at one stage with Ian Partridge, Jane Manning, who else? Anyway, Lionel Friend conducted that in England, and but it sort of hasn't had anything since then. I mean, it was a long time ago, 78, I think, 1978. So, you know, it as I say, it had it had 2 or 3 amateur performances. We did at one stage, talking to Gretchen, think it would be really nice to do it in the Wanganui, where the banners for Hotspur, which I think is some of her greatest work, they're stored in the Sargent there. I thought it'd be good to do it. But still.
We did do
dreams.
Hotspur. We did a production of Hotspur in 1993, Women's Suffrage
That's right,
Year,
yeah.
in the Wellington Town Hall, and the banners at that point, Gretchen's banners, were in Japan at the embassy. And so they had an agreement that if ever the work was performed, they would be returned. So the Japanese crated up in the ways that only the Japanese can, these amazing banners, and brought them back, and we were able to hang them and do that Hotspur performance, which was fabulous.
I don't know where they are now.
You said they were stored in Wanganui, but they're not.
Oh, no,
that's
no,
the Tristan
the
one.
Tristan
The Tristan
banners.
ones are stored in Wanganui.
Yes.
Yes, no, well, they belong to Foreign Affairs, so they'll be somewhere in the world.
I have a feeling they've been brought back here, but I don't know.
That's possible.
anyway.
We could find them. Any other questions? You can see this woman's had a very long and exciting career all over the world, and we're very privileged to be hosting the New Zealand premiere of this work.
Well, it's lovely to be back here.
Yes, it's great. Well, if there are no... Oh, yes, there's a question up here.
Can I just make a comment? I was at school with Gillian Whitehead Girls High School, 57 and 58. But I like to comment that Gillian actually hasn't had it as easy as it sounds. Because way back then, she was made to sit university entrance because she was taking music.
Yeah.
The rest of us were sort of scraped through with accreditation. But Gillian was made to sit, as only a couple of people were at the time. And she passed.
Oh, well,
Yeah, not brilliantly, I might add, but I passed.
I didn't have to tell people that. But, you know, listening to the story of Robin Hyde and how she had so many difficulties and wasn't recognised, Gillian had those too, didn't you? It was hard to make your way in the music world, just as it was hard for Robin way back. So I'd just like to draw attention to those similarities.
Well, yes, it's not easy, but... Or it wasn't easy. Well, it still is. I mean, actually, writing music isn't
ever easy.
isn't easy. No.
No.
But I wouldn't have changed it for anything. Yeah.
I think that's a very nice note to end on. Can you thank these two lovely women, and we'll let them go. And we'll see all of you, I hope, at the Theatre Royal at 2:00. Thank you.